Sometime this year, in 2023, India is set to overtake China as the most populous country in the world. And just at the end of last year, the world population surpassed the 8 billion mark. While these milestones are themselves interesting, they point to even bigger changes down the road. In this video, I'm going to look at 10 numbers that explain the population projections for the future of our planet, and how the demographics of our world will shift as time marches on. 10.4 billion, our first number, is the projected peak population of the world, sometime around the 2080s. But let's back up for a second. How did we get to 8 billion people on this earth? It was only about 220 years ago that we even passed the 1 billion mark, around the year 1804. It was then 1927 when the 2 billion mark was passed, and from there 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8 billion were all passed one by one, with about 11 to 14 years between each. Looking at it like this, things might look rather daunting. It might look like things will just continue on forever as that line goes straight up vertically. From as early as the 1800s, there have been fears about overpopulation, with several predictions of widespread famine and lack of resources if the world population continued on its path. The latest projections we have for the future world population paint a very different picture. Population growth has already slowed down below 1% per year, and the human population is not projected to go beyond 10.4 billion people. In fact, it may even begin to decline slightly before the end of the century. At the most fundamental level, population change is simply births versus deaths. When there are more babies being born than there are people dying, the population will increase. There are a lot of stats used to predict future population changes. One of the most important is fertility rate. This is defined as the average number of children per woman in a given population. An important number for demography in general, and the next number in this video, is 2.1. This is the replacement level of fertility needed to roughly maintain the current population over the long term. 2 children are required to replace the 2 parents, and then the 0.1 roughly accounts for premature deaths caused by things like infant mortality, disease, accidents, murder, suicide, etc. Looking at the global fertility rate, it's currently around 2.3. However, that number has been consistently falling for 60 years now, and that trend is very unlikely to change course anytime soon. It shouldn't be long before global fertility falls below replacement. The global number, though, doesn't really give us much information about the world, since it's just an average of wildly varying rates across the globe. Here we can see a breakdown of the fertility rates of every country in the world, and see just how much it varies between countries. The fertility rate itself is not enough information to predict population growth, however. Countries don't experience rapid population growth because more babies are being born, but rather when more children are surviving into adulthood. A falling death rate, primarily due to reduced infant mortality, is the second stage in what's called the demographic transition model. Infant mortality falls due to improved healthcare, sanitation and nutrition, among other things. Fertility rates generally remain constant for a time, but after a while, families generally start having fewer children as the likelihood of their survival increases. Better access to education and contraceptives and higher involvement of women in the workplace also play a major role. This lag between falling deaths and falling births creates a baby boom, and can be a great opportunity for a country to make considerable economic progress due to the high proportion of the working age population. This is known as a demographic dividend, and if taken advantage of, can be extremely advantageous for the country's future as a whole. At the start of the video, I mentioned that India will soon become the #1 country in the world by population. India is a perfect example of a country that has a demographic dividend and could potentially see tremendous economic growth over the coming decades. Here we can see India's population broken down by age group and how strong its working age population is, which will continue to grow for a long time still. India has already seen substantial economic growth over the previous decades and is currently the fastest growing major economy in the world. However, the demographic dividend is by no means an automatic process. It requires government policies, investments, and job creation to fully take advantage of the golden opportunity. Ineffective government and corruption can squander a country's opportunity to advance itself. It's also a double-edged sword because if jobs are not created for all these people, this will lead to mass unemployment as well as the emigration of the talented workers to higher income countries. India is already well along the demographic transition. This is clearly visible by taking a look at the country's population pyramid, which is a representation of the population broken down by age and sex. But because of its insanely large population, its smaller growth rate is still enough for it to be part of this video's next number. The UN projects that between now and 2050, just 8 countries will make up half the world's population increase. Aside from India, there's also Nigeria, Pakistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Egypt, and the Philippines. I listed the countries in order of their population growth in terms of the raw number of people, but it's worth noting that not only is India's growth rate lower, it's actually by far the lowest of any of these countries. If we extend this out to the end of the century, it now takes only 4 countries to account for nearly half the global population increase. It is worth noting at this point that the further in time we go, the more speculative these predictions become. It's more the general trends we're concerned with while using the best projections available for the present. The standout number for me in this table is the plus 330 million increase in the population of the DR Congo. That's an incredible 337% increase from its current population of just under 100 million. But even that's not the fastest growing country. Niger's population is projected to increase by a staggering 537% over the next 80 years. We can see that 5 of the top 6 countries are in Africa, all of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. Much of this region is in phase 2 of the previously mentioned demographic transition. Most countries are experiencing a baby boom, resulting in massive population growth now, which is projected to keep increasing over the coming decades. Many countries in this region have had falling infant mortality rates since the 1960s, but fertility rates are still the highest in the world. We can see the beginnings of falling fertility rates, but they're still well above replacement rates and are likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. Niger, for example, just finally dropped below 7 children per woman in 2019. Sub-Saharan Africa will be the fastest growing region in the world in the coming decades. It's also the poorest region. This is not a coincidence. For all the reasons mentioned before, there is a strong correlation between income and development with fertility rate. Put simply, richer and more developed countries have fewer children. The projected population of the continent as a whole by 2100 is nearly 4 billion, at which point it would comprise 38% of the world's population. That's up from about 18% that it is today. While some parts of Asia, like the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, are still growing rapidly, the continent as a whole is much further along than Africa, so it should come as no surprise that their population is projected to peak at around 5.3 billion by the 2050s, and actually experience a slow decline in the latter half of the century. The main reason for this, and one of the most shocking numbers in this video, minus 650 million. This is the projected population decline of China's population by 2100. While the global population will keep rising for some time, China's population has already peaked, actually recording a population decrease in 2022, the first time in over 60 years. The country is now on the verge of a period of rapid population decline. This is exactly the opposite problem of what China was facing just a few decades ago. With a fertility rate that peaked at over 7 children per woman back in the 1960s, there were worries that this population growth was completely unsustainable, and that the country would be unable to cope with all the additional people. It was in 1980 that China introduced its infamous one-child policy, in which couples were only permitted to have one child. This was despite the fact that fertility rates had dropped substantially in the preceding decades, down to about 2.7 by the time the policy was introduced. The single-child family was normalised and glorified through propaganda posters across the country, even going as far as to instill nationalism in its citizens, that having just one child was for the good of the country. The one-child policy remained in effect until as recently as 2015. Today, the CCP boasts that 400 million people were never born thanks to this policy, touting its success in fighting overpopulation. Of course, this came with a tremendous human suffering cost: forced sterilizations, forced abortions, and millions of baby girls abandoned or sold into human trafficking. And now, in addition to mass population decline, China also faces a significant gender imbalance. There are an estimated 30 million more men than women in China today. According to the UN's numbers, China's current population of about 1.4 billion will fall to 770 million by 2100. This 650 million decline would be a fall of 46%. And while it's impossible to know just how accurate these numbers will turn out to be, it's worth noting that these are actually the UN's medium fertility variant. According to the low fertility prediction, China's population would fall by a staggering 930 million. But even at the most optimistic, high fertility prediction, the population is still projected to fall by 270 million. China's current fertility rate is just 1.16, among the lowest in the world and well below replacement level. Will China remain as competitive with a shrinking population? Will the country's economy be able to keep growing, or will it shrink along with the population? And will its global profile continue to grow, or will it fail to solidify its position on the world stage? Only time will tell. Now, China stands out because of its massive population, but it's far from the only country facing a decreasing population. Here are the top 5 countries in terms of projected population decline, ranked by absolute numbers. Notably, South Korea is set to lose 53% of its population by 2100. This is due to the country's shockingly low fertility rate of just 0.88. South Korea has the lowest fertility rate of any country in the world. South Korea is a perfect example of a country that took advantage of the previously talked about demographic dividend, albeit with considerable support from the US and Japan. In just a matter of decades, South Korea went from one of the least developed countries to one of the most. And with that came a plummeting birth rate. The dividend, it seems, was more of a loan to the future, and that future is now for Korea. Of course, population decline is only part of the problem for these countries. The other issue is that their population is aging. An older population means fewer workers and more elderly people who need social care and pensions. A shrinking working age population must support a growing elderly population. Here's a breakdown of South Korea's population by age cohort, including projections going forward. As we can see here, the working age population has peaked and will rapidly decline over the next few decades. At the same time, the elderly population is increasing and the young population, i.e. the future working age population, is also declining. But not only is the working age population declining in absolute terms, its percentage of the population is also declining. Currently 71% of Korea's population is within the working age category, but based on its current trajectory, it will be just 46% by 2100. The working age and elderly population will be roughly the same. Japan too is an aging country, the oldest in the world in fact. The projected life expectancy of a Japanese person by 2100 is 94. Unlike China and South Korea, whose populations are on the verge of decline, Japan's has already been in decline for over a decade now, peaking around 2010. Japan being Japan, they've sought to alleviate some of the issues of an aging society with technology. Everything from VR to AI to robots that change an adult diaper, Japan has thought of it all. However, if early results are anything to go by, this likely isn't a situation that Japan can innovate itself out of. Technology can only do so much in caring for the elderly, and while certain innovations may be able to lessen the workload on certain staff members, it's unlikely that robots will be able to replace human workers anytime soon. Even if it were possible, there are potential legal and ethical questions that could be raised about this situation. Now, a much more practical way to deal with the issues resulting from a declining population is to get more people to come into the country. While the country did recently announce a new visa program for foreign workers from 14 different sectors, including, of course, elderly care, this will barely be enough to even make a dent in the issues that Japan is facing, particularly its labour shortage. And at least historically, Japan has preferred to restrict immigration rather than encourage it, so it's culturally and politically unlikely that immigration would be a major part of any solution. It's at this point in the video we're going to move away from Asia and on to Europe. Like the previously talked about countries of East Asia, much of Europe is also aging, as you can see from this map. The median age in Italy today, for example, is 47, and this is projected to reach 54. However, unlike the East Asian countries, Europe is relatively more accepting of immigration. Most of the wealthy European countries have a foreign-born population of 15% or higher, as you can see from this bar graph here. Since immigrants are generally younger, this expands a country's working age population. And while the populations of many European countries are projected to decline regardless, it's nowhere near as severe as over in East Asia. However, there are other countries in the Western world that are projected to continue growing for the rest of the century, despite all having fertility rates below replacement level. Of course, immigration is a two-way street. One country's immigration is another's emigration. This is where things get difficult for the typically less wealthy countries in Southern and Eastern Europe. Let's take a look at Bulgaria. In recent years, Bulgaria's net outflow has been about 10 to 15,000 people per year, and it was as high as 30,000 some years back in the 80s and 90s. Remember how I said Japan's population has been declining since 2010 and that South Korea is set to lose 53% of its population? Well, Bulgaria has them both beat. Bulgaria's population has been in decline since 1980. It peaked at about 9 million, today it's just under 7 million and is projected to fall to just 3 million. That's a fall of 66% from its peak population. As well as technology and immigration, another way for a government to help ease the stress of an aging population: make people retire later. However, this hasn't gone over too well in France, where people were unhappy about the government's plan to raise the state pension age from 62 to 64. To show their discontent, the French did what the French do best: protest. Life expectancy in France has been rising consistently since the post-war period and is currently around 83 years. It could certainly be argued that raising the retirement age as life expectancy increases makes a lot of sense, especially when there will be fewer working age people to generate tax revenue for the government to support an ever-increasing number of retirees. On the other hand, the case could be made that people should be allowed to enjoy their golden years to the fullest, and living a longer life should not mean being forced to work to an older age. It could be dangerous to simply raise the retirement age in line with life expectancy, since it would cut into the healthiest years of a person's retirement. The current highest retirement age of any country is the Netherlands at 68, with also a few other countries with plans to raise to that level gradually over the years. In the UK, for example, the current age to receive a state pension is 66, with plans to raise that to 67 in 2028 and 68 by 2037. There are even speculations about when it might someday be raised to 69 and 70. And this will likely become the norm across the globe as we enter into this new era of aging populations. So we've looked at ways that governments might try to deal with an aging population, but isn't there something even more obvious? Just raise the birth rate. This would address the root problem rather than just deal with its effects. Several countries have already introduced cash incentives for families to have children, but thus far with somewhat limited success. Even if it were possible to raise the birth rate, it would take about 20 years before the benefits of any scheme would even come to fruition. Now, it would be rather simplistic to just look at an aging population as a problem that needs to be solved. If it even can be, it might just be the natural progression of human development. After all, infinite population growth is surely not sustainable over the long term. Perhaps we may simply have to adapt to the changing times and accept certain changes in our society and the economy. So, with all these changes happening in the world, let's take a look at how they'll affect the top 10 countries by population between now and the end of the century. Starting in 2023 with India overtaking China. It doesn't take long for Mexico and Russia to fall out of the top 10 as Ethiopia and Congo enter it. And by the 2050s, both Nigeria and Pakistan overtake the United States. Moving into the second half of the century, we can clearly see China's rapid population decline. 2 more African countries enter the top 10, Egypt and Tanzania. And here is the final list for 2100. Of course, these numbers are just projections at this point, only time will tell just how accurate they'll turn out to be. Now, if you're a regular viewer of mine, you'll know that I try to make my videos as neutral and impartial as possible. This can oftentimes be challenging given the state of the media industry, which can be biased, sensationalized, or not entirely factual. Thankfully, Ground News is here to help you navigate the news. Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform. It's a website and app that lets you compare news headlines from around the world. For every story, there's a bias, factuality, and ownership rating for each news source covering that story. You can compare different headlines from different outlets while noting their political leaning and see which parts of the story are emphasized, exaggerated, or left out entirely. Ratings come from independent news monitoring organizations. For example, for topics covered in this video, you might want to check out what different outlets are saying about China's population decline or France's pension reform, and you can go directly to each article from the app or website, while having information about political leaning and factuality. This will help you get the full picture and the most accurate information. Ground News also has a cool feature called Blind Spot, which lets you see stories that are not being covered by one side of the political spectrum or the other. You can make sure you're not missing key information that's out there but maybe not being reported by the websites you typically visit. You can even customize your experience by selecting topics, places, or people you want to follow. And later you can check out your own media bias and see the political leanings and factuality of the articles that you've been reading. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, you can get started now for free by going to ground.news/wonderwhy or subscribe to get access to all the features mentioned here. You can click the link in the video description to get started now, and you'll also be helping support this channel in the process. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.